Thank you all for coming. And, for those of you who have been here every week we've done a little bit of a COVID update. We talked first about how to keep oneself healthy. We also talked about how to keep your family healthy. And then we talked about also what to do if one of your family members got sick. The other thing we did was talked about how, to open up a practice. We never closed the Chinese acupuncture clinic practice. And what we did is we have, even still, we support social distancing. So just for acupuncturists who may not have been here in the past, we basically closed our reception room. And at this point in time, people have to come in or wait on the front porch. The minute they step into our office, they get put into a room. We set aside 2 rooms that are just for people who may be ill or feeling unwell. And the rest of the rooms in the clinic, we put everybody in who may be coming in with normal, maybe hip pain or whatever. So, besides that, we have a service that comes in every night and has this big fogging, disinfecting machine that goes through the entire office and disinfects the entire office. While we're there, we have extra staff now because we clean the bathrooms, we clean the doorknobs, the handles on the faucets, everything. We took all of the chairs out of rooms that had cloth seats in them and put plain old metal chairs in there because it makes it much easier to clean between patients. So those are some of the things that we've been talking about for the past few weeks. I'm going to do a short update, and then I'm going to introduce Joe Hollis, who's a master herbalist, and not only grows herbs here in the mountains of North Carolina, but he also knows how to prepare those, because there are specific preparations for Chinese herbal medicines. You pick them at specific times of the year, and there are always there are ways to prepare them. So in looking at what's happening with the coronavirus now, it seems that we've gotten a little bit of a flat line here in North Carolina. And one of the interesting things about this is that I was reading a lot today about people who have survived it. And it's time that we start looking at those people who are surviving it, because we are hearing that some of the things that we may be told that in 2 weeks that you're over this are not really the case. Okay? It's a lot more complicated than that. They've said that now it's biphasic. In other words, you could have a second infection, and at this point in time, they don't know if it's a second infection or if it's a reemergence of the other. But because it's biphasic, you actually would end up with a whole different set of symptomology. And so it's not like the symptoms you had the first time, you would be having the second time. The World Health Organization has said they do not know why it appears that we are having reactivation. The scientists in the USA say, well, no, that's not happening because it hasn't happened with the 2 previous. It didn't happen with SARS and it didn't happen with MERS. But I think the people who are recovering are the ones that we're seeing who have the most information about what's happening. Another thing that's happening in China now, for those of you who are not Chinese medicine practitioners, you may not know, but the lungs and the large intestine are a yin and yang couple. And so here in the United States, when we do a throat swab, and someone may have been in the hospital for a couple of weeks, and once the throat swab is showing that they're clear, they're being released from the hospitals here. In China and in a number of European countries, that's not the case. Because what they've seen is that the virus, there are viral remnants in the colon. And in fecal swabs, they're seeing that could be a virus even a month after someone has been admitted into the hospital. And so in China, they're not releasing people from hospitals until they see that the viral fragments are also clear in the colon. So they're using not just the throat swabs or the nasal swabs, but fecal swabs in China. I was reading today in just looking up articles right and left, and I got to read about why Chinese medicine was not useful in COVID. And it was very clear that they were saying that it's basically there are no approved cures for COVID-19 at this point in time. And I think that all of us would understand that. It's not that in Chinese medicine we're saying that there's an herb at this point that cures it, but what they are saying that in Western medicine they have to do symptomatic treatment. And our concern as Chinese medicine doctors, if we're seeing people early on when they get COVID, that maybe we can help to prevent hospitalization from some of these people, because we have a long history of working with viral infections. And I'm sure that many of you may know that, oh my goodness, what year was that? In 2000 and, Joe, do you remember what year it was that they were basically the lady scientist, gosh, I don't even remember her name all of a sudden, but the cure for malaria was a Chinese herb that we've been using for thousands of years, Qing Hao. And that the lady received a Nobel Prize for that. So Chinese medicine's already been recognized, worldwide for being able to work with malaria. And it's only a matter of time before they see what we're able to do with our patients who also have an active virus. I think there are a number of clinics that are starting to open up here. If any of you have questions or anything or would like to ask me, feel free to contact me at the office or at Daoist Traditions. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Joe. Joe Hollis was born in Raleigh, North Carolina. So he is a homegrown boy right here in our beautiful state. Graduated from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and after graduating spent 3 years in the Peace Corps in Borneo. For almost 50 years, he's lived on the side of one of the highest mountain ranges in eastern North Carolina, and he's been growing Chinese herbal medicines. Today, I feel like we're going to have our own Daoist hermit here. He lives about an hour and a half from Asheville, and I've been blessed to get to know Joe since he began teaching at Daoist Traditions when it opened in 2003. He's taught botany, he's taught herbal preparations, and again, he's taught the use of pao zai, basically pao zai, which is how to prepare herbs so they become the powerful medicinals they are. And Joe, thank you so very much for coming, and I'm going to turn it over to you. We look forward to hearing whatever you have to share with us, whether it's about Daoist mystics or whether it is about the herbal medicines that you've been growing for almost 50 years now. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. I'm really delighted to be speaking to you all about this topic. So I've been interested in this concept of Chinese hermits for a very long time, at least 40 years, maybe 50, pretty much as long as I've been living on the side of the mountain. Actually, I'm kind of a cinephile. I've been interested in all things Chinese my whole life, really. Chinese poetry, Chinese philosophy, Chinese landscapes, Chinese painting, Chinese everything, food. It all appeals to me. Uh, but when so I was going to just sort of give a historical presentation about this idea of Chinese hermits. And I've read a number of books on the subject. It's a very lively subject in the history of China. This is a very well-known topic, this idea of people who drop out from society and refuse to work for the government. But Cissy said she thought it'd be more interesting if I kind of focused it a little bit more on how I personally relate to this subject and what I get out of it. So there'll be a little bit of each. So let's see. What I get out of this, so my whole philosophy, which I developed about the time I moved here 50 or so years ago, is that no person is an island, as we know. Everybody's got to be part of something bigger. And essentially, we have two choices right now in time as far as what bigger thing we're going to be part of. We can either be part of nature, which is what we always were, the superorganism we call Gaia, or we can be part of civilization, the state, the economy, whatever you want to call it. The entity, the blood of which is money, basically. Money is what, the circulation of money is what determines the state or the economy or so on. And so my philosophy and what I've been trying to do my whole life is figure out a way that we can get back from being part of, because we're all born being part of what I call civilization. You could call it the state, you could call it the economy, whatever you want, but it's this huge superstructure of human beings taking up all these different niches and exchanging information and around. And it all started with the origins of agriculture, and there's a lot of people who say anymore that the origins of agriculture was a pretty big mistake for humankind, that we should have just stayed with nature and being part of nature. But now we're stuck with being part of civilization. And it's how could we get back to being part of nature if we actually want to do that? So in trying to do this, I have found a great deal of support from this whole idea of Chinese hermits, because that's exactly what they wanted to do. And I should say quickly that there's two kinds of Chinese hermits. There's the kind that wanted to drop out from society and go back to the farm. There's a whole dissertation I got a hold of called Taking Up the Plow. And then there's a different kind of Chinese hermits who are the ones who want to go way back in the mountains and live in a cave and meditate all day. So these are kind of two different, rather different things. They're both hermits, and I'll talk a little bit about each kind. But first of all, I'm talking about the kind who just wanted to drop out of the government and go back to their farms. And this was essentially a moral issue for these people. As we know, Confucianism is a highly moral religion. In a way, it's not even really a religion. It's kind of compared to, say, Christianity or Judaism or Islam, which all had prophets and revealed whatever knowledge. Confucianism is essentially a system of ethics. It's just like moral behavior is what Confucius was teaching. And so in ancient China, literati is how it's usually translated, and the expectation was that you would work for the government in some capacity to help out the people. So but then what happens if the government is corrupt? A situation that, you know, we might think about currently. What happens if it's a corrupt government? Do you really want to work for them? So a lot of these Chinese literati, who are very moral people, said, no, I don't want to work for this corrupt government. This came to a head at the end of the Han, when the country broke up into a number of smaller little dynasties, the Jin and the Ying, and I forget how many of them. There's a whole period of time when there wasn't really one dynasty ruling all of China, and a lot of warfare and so on. And so a lot of these people wanted to just quit and go back to the farm. And in fact, this became quite a big thing, to the point really where the people who were wanting to refuse to work for the government were regarded as the most moral people in the country. Like they had higher standards. They had a higher degree of respect than the people that were working for the government, which is a really interesting situation. And then you have, so then the government in turn is wanting to hire the most responsible people. So the government is precisely wanting to hire the people that are trying to drop out from society. And there's a little story here I like to read. Yu plowed with his own hand for his food. The king of Chu sent a messenger with 100 measures of gold and 2 4-horse carriages to go and invite his services. His Majesty desires to request you to administer Huainan. Yu laughed and didn't reply. The messenger, being unable to talk to him, went away. Then his wife came home from the market and she said, when you were young, you carried out your principles. Surely when you're becoming old, you're not abandoning them? Why are the carriage tracks outside so deep? She knows that there's some big carriages have come to visit. Chen said, the king doesn't know my unworthiness. He desires to make me administer Huainan. He sent a messenger with gold and horses. She says, were you able to refuse? He says, riches and honor are what men desire. Why do you hate them? Of course, I accept it. His wife says, the righteous man takes no action except according to propriety. He does not, because of poverty, change his principles. He does not, because of a humble position, alter his conduct. In serving you, I've plowed with your own hand for your food. I have myself spun thread for your clothes. Your food has been ample. Your clothes have been warm. Your actions have been based on righteousness. If happiness in it has indeed been self-sufficient, if you accept the heavy emoluments of others, if you ride in others' strong carriages, behind others' fine horses, if you eat others' rich and fine foods, how then will you behave? Yu says, I didn't accept. So the upshot of it is that they decide they need to migrate away from the country because somehow the government will keep pestering him. So he takes his plow on his back and she takes her loom on her back, and they go away and they're never seen again. And there are lots of stories like this. There are stories like this in Zhuangzi, where he says they come to offer him money, and he talks about the turtle that's being kept in the capital and treated really well, but one of these days they're going to slit its throat and use it for divination of the I Ching. And he says, do you think that turtle would be happy to be in the capital, or would be rather dragging its tail in the mud? And they say, well, drag its tail in the mud. And he says, yeah, then go away and let me to drag my tail in the mud. And this is a whole ethical thing that's going on in China. There are actually several different books on the topic that have been published, in case anybody gets as interested as I am. I have a very historical kind of mind, and as soon as I get interested in something, I immediately want to read about the history of it. So here's a book. It might be, I don't know if this will be backwards or if you can read this. Looks like it's going to be backwards. Mm-hmm. Men of the Cliffs and Caves by Ott Vervoon. The development of the Chinese Hermetic tradition to the end of the Han Dynasty. And then there's another one called Patterns of Disengagement. The practice and portrayal of reclusion in early medieval China. That's from the Han Dynasty onwards. So this is a huge phenomenon, and it's very much commented on. Another reason why it interests me, so these people, as I say, these are very highly moral people, and they are deriving a great deal of energy and purpose to the life from Confucius and from the Tao Te Ching. Like chapter 80 of the Tao Te Ching is exactly a vision of what Joseph Needham called the return to cooperative primitivity. The whole idea of this kind of Taoist vision, which they had for a while before it came to seem hopeless to them, that society might be reorganized as just small villages where people just stay home and grow food and make their clothes. And they don't need any weapons and so on. You can read chapter 80, and it ends up with, though the next village over might be so close that you can hear the roosters crowing and the dogs barking, you'd grow old and die without ever having bothered to go there because you're so content being at home. So that was a certain vision that the Daoists had at some point in time of how the world might work. So, as I say, they derived a lot of energy from reading Confucius and the Tao Te Ching, and there's a lot of poetry. So the Chinese are possibly the greatest of all the arts that the Chinese worked with, and they did everything. You know, they wrote plays and they had novels and they did paintings and all the different arts and music and opera and so on. But according to a number of people, the art that is the greatest of the Chinese is poetry. And a huge part of Chinese poetry is nature poetry, what's called mountains and rivers poetry, shan shui, or wilderness poetry. So what these people wanted to do, and if you read a book like, I didn't bring it down with me, Mountain Home by David Hinton, it's an anthology, it's called The Wilderness Poetry of Ancient China, a number of different poets. And what they were really interested in was going into the wilderness. So you have story after story about people who are, you know, they have these really high ideals, they pass the civil service exam, they get a pretty high position, they're really out to help the people and reduce the taxation burden and so on. And then they get into this super vicious infighting that was apparently constantly going on at court between different factions, and whatever faction could get the ear of the emperor, they would immediately get all of the other factions exiled. Like, get them out of here, you know. They didn't execute people, they just sent you down to southern China where there was all kinds of malaria and everything else going on. But also incredibly beautiful landscapes, mountainous landscapes down there. So you get lots of people who start off as idealistic Confucians who really want to help the people, and they get exiled down to these mountain landscapes. And they sort of switch over and become Taoists. And all Chinese are kind of some combination of Confucian and Taoist, the Confucian side being serve the people and the Taoist side being follow the Tao. So when trying to serve the people doesn't, it kind of comes up poorly, they revert to following the Tao. I mean, and another very standard thing in China is you're a Confucian for the active part of your life up until you're 60 or 70 years old, and then you spend the rest of your life being a Taoist and meditating and doing Tai Chi and so on and trying to improve yourself. So what they wanted to do was get into the wilderness. And the reason they wanted to get into the wilderness is because that is where the true nature is. What's called Sujan or Zizhan, which is the world coming into being by itself, where it's all actually happening. So if you look at a mountain, you see that the clouds tend to form on the top of the mountain. We live here in the mountains, we get to see this kind of thing. And to them, that was like exactly how it is, that the world is coming into being all by itself, especially in the mountains. The farther you can get away from civilization, the closer you're getting to Ziwan, this world coming into being by itself. And that's where they wanted to be. They wanted to be part of that action of the world creating itself. So they would go climbing up these creeks and up these mountains and trying to get into the most wilderness situations they possibly could. And that's what they wrote a lot of their poetry about, the wilderness poetry of ancient China. But then it gets to be pretty inconvenient to constantly be going all the way up these creeks and to these really, really remote areas. So there starts to be the concept of, and this is very fascinating to me as a gardener, because my garden is very much based on Chinese garden principles. I think gardening is one of the really great Chinese arts, and Chinese gardens are some of the greatest gardens that have ever been made. Especially there's a lot of them down in Suzhou, which is kind of it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site because of the Chinese gardens that are down there. And there are various principles on which these gardens are based. It's a lot like the health of a human being. You want to balance everything, starting with the yin and yang, and then balance the 5 elements, 5 directions, 5 seasons, and so on. It's all about balance, just like health is all about balance. So there starts to be this idea that you can capture this Zhujian kind of energy in a garden if you create the garden in the right way with the right sensibility. Because what they wanted to do in these gardens was personal self-development. So in these gardens, not to say that they didn't do a lot of entertaining and played drinking games where they floated cups of wine down a little windy creek, and you had to write a answering couplet to the previous couplet, or else you had to take a drink, that kind of thing. But mostly what they were doing in these gardens was meditating, writing poetry, doing painting, doing Tai Chi exercises, playing the lute, different kinds of meditative activities designed for spiritual advancement. And that has to do with taking in chi. So the whole idea of the garden was to design a garden with perfect chi. So if you go up, follow some little creek into the wilderness up the side of a mountain, that's going to be perfect chi. But can you create that in your own garden? Well, that's one of the things that they were working on. So that comes into the picture of these people who are dropping out, refusing to work for the government and going home to farm. A lot of them are also making these gardens to create this perfect chi kind of situation. So there's a lot of different elements going on here. And there's some really great poetry being written. And this is one of the things that really drew me into all this was the poetry of a man named Dao Yuan Ming, who is regarded as one of the greatest of Chinese poets. I guess that's probably going to be backwards too. The easiest, the most accessible way to get a hold of Dao Yuan poetry is it's a very small little paperback of translations by David Hinton, who is a really excellent translator. He's translated Zhuangzi, and I believe some of Confucius, and all the major Chinese poets. He's the translator of the book I referenced called Mountain Home, The Wilderness Poetry of Ancient China. And he's got separate little books out on most of the major poets, and he's got one out on Dao Yuan Ming that would be easily accessible. It's got about 60 or 70 of his key poems. So Dao Yuan Ming became famous for quitting his job and going back to the farm. This whole thing we've been talking about here. He's one of those kind of recluses. And there's actually a quite well-known story about how he's struggling along as a farmer, and everybody says, oh, you should get a government job, because he was a literati. He's a literate person, and he could handle an administrative job. And so finally he gives in and takes a job, and he has it for about 30 days, and he just can't stand it. And what does he say here? If I've got the right quote. Shoot, I thought I had it here. Oh, bother. This one? Well, I'll just have to paraphrase it. So he has this job, and after about 30 days, and one of his lackeys comes in and says, there's a high official here. You could need to put on your insignia of office and go out and greet him, and bow down to him and everything. And he says, I'm not bowing down to some clodhopper for a measly bushel of rice. And he throws down his belt, which is like his insignia of office, and leaves and goes home. That's one version of his story. There are a couple of other versions that he talks about. Shoot. After a few days, I had a feeling of longing to return home, for spontaneity of my nature cannot be forced. and coerced, though hunger and cold are pressing. To go against myself makes me ill. Whenever I have engaged in men's affairs, it has been in my mouth and belly that have served for their own sake. I was sad and distressed and deeply ashamed on account of my former ideals. I expected to stay 1 year and then gather up my skirts and go by night, but soon after my sister died, my feeling was to hurry home, and accordingly I left my post. And so he writes a poem called Return Home. My fields and gardens will be covered with weeds. Why not return? When I made my heart the body's slave, why should I sorrow and solitarily grieve? Aware that the past may not be censored, I know that the future is to be striven for. Truly, I'm not that far astray from the road. I feel today is right, yesterday was wrong. Then he goes on about going home and his kids coming out the door to greet him. The paths are overgrown. They have a bottle of homemade wine. Tao Yuan Ming really liked to drink wine. Lots of poems on that topic. He wrote several different poems on this, the subject of returning home. And here's a little bit of a biography, a sort of a mock biography that he wrote for himself called The Biography of the Gentleman of Five Willows. We don't know of what place this gentleman is native, nor do we know his family or his courtesy name. Around his house there were 5 willows. And from this he took his literary name. Quiet and a few words, he does not desire glory or profit. He delights in study, but does not seek abstruse explanations. Whenever there is something of which he apprehends the meaning, then in his happiness he forgets to eat. By nature he's fond of wine, but his family is poor and he can't usually get it. His relatives and friends know that this is so and sometimes set out wine and invite him. Whenever he goes to a party, he'll drink to the end. He expects that he will certainly get drunk. When he's drunk, he will withdraw, but he never regrets that he must go. He goes on for a bit. The appraisal Chenlo had a saying, one who does not grieve over poverty and low position, one is not concerned about riches and high rank. Maybe we not think he was speaking of this sort of man. Drinking wine and writing poems to please his own will. Is he not a man of the time of Lord Wu Hai or Lord Ko Tien?
So, Joe.
It's a bit of his self-image. Yes.
So,
hello?
Really interesting hearing you talk and about these people who also were, Daoist recluses. But in some ways, I've seen, feel that from you, because the few times I've seen you are the times that you've come in to teach the students. And, is there something that, what in your life put, besides the love of Chinese medicine, put you to a place where you basically have created this, almost this amazing place way up high in the mountains where I know our students have spent much time. But how did that come about for you?
Well, as I said, I was interested in this idea that instead of, so we're all born being part of civilization, and we're all born into this situation where what we have to do is go out and get a job and get some money. We'll just do one thing, with our lives, and we'll get money, and then we'll fulfill all of our needs with our money. We'll go to the grocery store, and we'll go to the gym, and we'll go to the movies, and we'll go to church, and it's all spending money to fulfill our needs. And versus the alternative, which is a life in nature, is that all the needs are integrated and you fulfill your needs by just going out the door, and gathering food, and you get your exercise in the way of doing that, and you get inspired, and you're living in nature, and it's beautiful. And you can collect your medicine if you need it, and it's all there all together. You're not like sitting in the office all day and then having to go and pay money at a gym to get some exercise, for example. So I became convinced that, it was a huge mistake for humans to ever stop being part of nature. Like there are few people that still are, we call them foragers, hunter-gatherers, they still live in the embrace of nature, and they have a whole different philosophical attitude towards the planet. Believe me, we wouldn't be destroying the planet if those people's ideals were still calling the shots.
Right.
The disaster of civilization is once you translate everything into money money's kind of the universal solvent. You know, money can dissolve anything and turn it into anything else. So that's exactly what I'm trying to escape. So I got this little few acres, 2.5 acres. It just sort of fell into my lap. It's undoubtedly destiny, I would say, personally, to try and demonstrate or try and figure out, really, is there a way that we can get back to living as part of nature? And I certainly have not managed to get totally free of money, but I think I'm a lot freer of it than a lot of people, for sure. It's not very high on my value system to make more money. Mainly, I'm just trying to set up what I call a paradise garden, which is a situation. So, I mean, the problem with living according to nature, as a forager, let's say, is you need a couple of square miles per person. So the carrying capacity is just not there. So what I'm trying to do is take my environment and just pack it with more and more useful plants, medicinal herbs, edible vegetables, perennials, wild foods, you know, so that I can support more people on just a couple of acres of land. So that's been the exercise that I'm kind of working on for the past 50 years in the philosophy of it. And I derive great strength from the example of these Chinese hermits. Dao Yuan Ming's favorite phrase, and he uses it in many of his poems, is steadfast in adversity. And he got that out of Confucius. There's a story in Confucius where Confucius is kind of wandering around, you know, looking for some nobleman who will believe in him and embrace his philosophy. So there's a period of time when there are a lot of different schools of philosophy, and they're all trying to find some government that will embrace their philosophy. So he's wandering around, and it comes to a point where they're lost in this forest somewhere in Lu, and they haven't had anything to eat in about a week, and everybody's fallen over with hunger. And one of his students comes up to him and he says, Are superior people supposed to be subjected to this kind of adversity? And Confucius says, in adversity, weak people go to hell, and the superior man is steadfast in adversity. That's his answer. And Dao Yuan Ming loved it. I mean, he had his hard times. He's got poems about his house burning down. He's got a poem about being so hungry one night that he just goes out on the street and he knocks on the first door he comes to, and he says, "Could you please give me something to eat?" That's hard to do. So he refers again and again to this kind of thing, that he's gaining strength from reading the classics. And me too. I gain strength from reading Dao Yuan Ming.
Well, Joe, this is really, really beautiful. And, you know, steadfast in adversity seems to be where, you know, at this point in our lives, and there, you know, whether what's going on a physical plane with this illness, or what's going on the psychological issues of the politics, there's so much disjointedness right now there. But I think all of us, if we take the steadfast in adversity that you shared with us tonight, that's something we can all hold on to. You know, we usually try and end these right at 8 o'clock, and I'm going to talk really quickly about, you know, just 5 things that we've spoken about before. And we've talked about Qigong, and we all learned Qigong tapping to keep the kidneys strong. The kidneys, again, are the root of our Jing essence. We've talked about the liver, and that I really strongly recommend that people not be going out and sprinting and jogging and doing long runs right now, but that we go to long, relaxing walks, because the blood is moved by qi, and we know that liver controls the movement of qi in our body and basically makes all the qi move. We talked about the diaphragm, having to be open for the qi of the lungs to descend to the kidneys. And that is ruled over by the liver. And because walking is the exercise for the liver, a minimum of an hour a day walking for your liver health. Heart, we've talked about sleep. We all have to get a really good night's sleep because that's what keeps our heart strong. And we know that our heart is really what motivates and keeps our brain working because it's just the library. And then lung and spleen being postnatal qi. Lung, making sure that, again, whether we're doing qigong, whether we are out walking, that is helping the lung or liver. And again, right now, wearing mask. I'm just going to keep saying it over and over, particularly when you're out in grocery stores. And the spleen, you know, this is not our time to be drinking more alcohol, unless, of course, you're a Daoist recluse, and that's part of your path to enlightenment. And there were many, many Daoist monks and recluse who, I bet Joe could tell us some stories about these other Daoists who were basically part of their path was to just not worry about anything, and they were drinking constantly. So, but the spleen has to do with making sure that we're eating well. So remember, let's take care of our lung, our spleen, our liver, our heart, and kidney, and all of that just has to do with finding balance. I so appreciate you coming tonight, Joe. And we have about just a few more minutes because I just wanted to remind people, let's be out there, let's be out walking. Joe, are you still with me? I've unmuted you if you, oh, Joe.
Oh, I'm here.
Okay, well, we've got just a few more minutes. And that was so beautiful what you said about steadfast in adversity. I just thought maybe we've got about 5 more minutes before we go out. If there's something else or another story you'd like to share with us from any of the Daoist books you read for the last 5 minutes, that would be beautiful.
Okay, I will.
And then maybe at the very end, we'll take questions.
Yeah, that's
Sure.
right. We always do. We do questions, so that'd be great. We'll have questions for both Joe and me. That'd be wonderful.
Okay.
Do you need that light?
What?
Don't you need that light?
No, it makes a glare. Okay, I'm on.
You are on.
Hello? Okay, well, I could take just 5 minutes and talk about the other kind of Taoist hermits. And that's the kind that really want to go up in the cave and just meditate all the time. So those first kind of hermits, they lived in villages, they had families, they had good friends. There were even certain villages that were mostly literati, you know, so these were all really like-minded people because they were all intentionally dropping out from society. It's not like they were just of the peasant class, right? But then there's the other kind of hermits, and they are really want to be hermits. That's more like what we think of as hermits in Western religion. These are the people that want to go up and live in a cave on the mountainside as remote as possible and spend most of their lives meditating. And they kind of get out and gather some wild food and so on, and do a little bit of cultivation of maybe some rice or gather bamboo shoots, whatever. So there are a couple of good references on them. There still are very definitely such people back in China in the mountains. And one of the first people that wrote about this was Bill Porter, who translates from the Chinese under the name of Red Pine, but he writes books about China under the name of Bill Porter. He lives part-time out in the Pacific Northwest and a lot in China. This is probably came up backwards. It's called The Road to Heaven, Encounters with Chinese Hermits. And he wondered whether there were still hermits. And everybody he asked in the government, you know, and in the Daoist administration said, oh, no, there's no hermits left anymore. So he went out in the mountains and found a bunch of hermits and writes about them in this book. Quite fascinating. And then about 20 years later or so, another man comes along, inspired by Bill Porter's book. This is Zhang Jianfeng, A Journey to Inner Peace and Joy, Tracing Contemporary Chinese Hermits. So he kind of goes back into the same mountainous areas. This is nice because it's got a lot of really amazing colored photographs of the situations where these hermits are living. And interviews a lot of them and talks about what their motivations are for living out there all by themselves. And then somebody else, inspired also by Bill Porter, made a very nice YouTube video called Among White Clouds. I highly recommend it. They go out and visit 4 or 5 of these hermits, and they're quite different. You know, one of them is an old woman living by herself. One of them is like a couple of old monks living together. One of them is like a teacher who has some young students. So it's a little variety of different types of Chinese hermits. I think you'll enjoy it a lot. Bill Porter also translated a book called The Zen Poetry of Stonehouse, which is some really wonderful nature poetry written by a Zen monk who lived by himself on a mountaintop for a long time. That's under the name of Red Pine. So there's plenty of really great stuff. Cold Mountain is wonderful poetry by Han Shan. There's so much really terrific Chinese nature poetry around this theme of sort of dropping out of society. So if you like that kind of thing, there's lots of fun stuff to read.
Thank you, Joe. So let's start my video. So Jeannie, can you put Joe and I both on the screen? I don't know if that's a possibility.
No, that's not a possibility. But
okay. So I saw a comment earlier from someone who said that they both, she had 2 family members who both she knew had a resurgence or another resurgence, well, basically another case of COVID. I'm wondering, you know, there's so much going on about saying that it's a 2-week thing, and I really, really do not believe that. Someone asked about the previous Qigong tapping on your YouTube channel. I think Tracy's video has been put up now, Tracy Peck, who did some Qigong. I have the massage that I did on a child. But, you know, I think all of us really need to be aware that there are going to be people who have this more than once. The thing to remember, they really do not know, okay? And you said, thank you for speaking up, that I did refer to as being biphasic, and that was something reading today. And you're telling us that this was your family's experience. And again, it's a real different set of symptomology that comes up. We know, again, you have to remember that I've spoken to our students a lot about how different Chinese medicine was in China, just because they lived very, very different lives. You know, they were an agrarian culture, and it's only in the last, when I was there the first time in 1987, there were still no cars, and there was certainly not malls and everything going on right now. So, you know, we have to look at what's happening with us here in the United States and not just look at what's happening in China, because I think that we're seeing here that in the Western world, just in France and the Netherlands, 30 to 70% of the people who go into ICUs are developing blood clots, okay? So I'm going to tell you, walk, 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 because Qi moves blood. And if you end up in a situation where you contract COVID, the stronger your Qi is and the more it's moving blood from heavy exercise, I think the better you're going to do.
We have a couple of questions. There's a question for Joe. What is the name of the Confucius person that you were reading from who said the part about steadfast in a state of emergency?
Adversity, not emergency. Well, that is that actual phrase comes out of Confucius, out of the Analects. But the person who was utilizing that a lot in his poetry was Taoyuan-Ming, spelled usually Taoyuanming. He's considered to be one of the greatest of all Chinese poets. He's from about 400 AD, I think. He's a little bit earlier. The main great Chinese landscape poets, Li Bai and Du Fu and Wang Wei, that's all Tang Dynasty. He's before that. He's like the first. And he actually founds a whole genre of poetry called farm and garden poetry, which is kind of a subcategory within mountains and rivers poetry, which is nature poetry in general.
And there's another question.
Ming. Yes?
Oh, sorry. There's another question, which is, do you grow all of the herbs that you use in your medicines, or do you have to order some of them?
No, we order a lot of them from China, from usually either Spring Wind or Golden Needle. I grow them, but I don't grow enough of them. So my place is kind of like a botanical garden of herbs, and I might have, 6 or 7 or 8 of each different thing, because I got like, 75 or 80 different Chinese herbs. I just don't have that much land to grow a whole 50-foot bed of each herb. We're trying to work towards that. But at the moment, the herbs I grow, it's mainly to be able to sell seeds and to divide them and sell plants to other people who want to grow them. But I don't, in a lot of cases, have enough to utilize, certainly not for decoctions. We do use our herbs in making tinctures of formulas. We make a lot of tinctures of Chinese formulas. So in that case, I don't necessarily need that much herbs. Like, the amount of herbs that'll make you a month's worth of tincture is the same amount of herbs that'll make you 3 days worth of decoction.
Right, thank you. And there's another question, which is, how does somebody order from you, Joe?
So what we sell is seeds, and then we also provide bare root plants. And people can come out to the gardens. I have a bunch of plants in pots, and we also have a number of immune boosting tinctures and antiviral tinctures. We've set up a little herb shop partway up the driveway because my main building is closed. Or you can order from me by email, joehollisherbs@gmail.com. And if you forget that, just Google Mountain Gardens and you'll find me. And on the Mountain Gardens website, there's a whole list of all the plants and seeds that we have available. We do not mail tinctures, but we sell tinctures here at the place.
Great, thank you so much.
Yes?
Yesterday, I was out with Joe out of his land, and I went out because I wanted to get the Chinese. There's so many different types of chrysanthemum, and I wanted to get some chrysanthemum. And so Joe basically went and dug me up 3 different types of chrysanthemum that I'm planning on a hill because I love chrysanthemum tea. And it's one of the things that I just went out there and got from him yesterday. But the other thing is just walking along with him yesterday. We were eating some of the fresh buds off of a pine tree, and then I said something about his hostas, and I did not know this, but many of us know about fiddleheads, that if we cut those very early, they're great greens to cook. And I did not know that hostas were always also the same thing, because every year I have many hostas coming up. And so he talked about how right before they start uncurling, that's when you cut them, and they're great to put in saute in a pan and to eat hostas. I want to respond to someone asked about latency with COVID, and also talked about I think we put down Joe's address so you can contact him. A couple of people have talked about having very different kinds of symptoms. We know some people have had a lot of digestive systems, and not everybody has fevers and coughs. One of the people spoke up about they had been on a hike for 12 miles, and their symptoms were very mild. But one of the things I have seen is that I have seen people that it takes generally about a month. And I have people that I really do believe had this in early January, looking back, that basically it's taken them a couple of months to get their energy back. So this is a time to continue for, in some ways, all of us to become recluses and stay home and not push yourself if you have COVID. We really know nothing about this at this point. And so the best thing we can do right now is to live like Joe and to basically go into a reclusive area and just stay quiet. That's one of the best things that we can do. The other thing someone asked is about latency. Where anytime we have a virus, part of our constitution tells us where it's going to go. Is it going to come to our lungs first, or is it going to bypass our lungs and go directly to our digestive system? You know, a stomach virus, a lung virus, you know, it's oftentimes from a Chinese medicine perspective, that has to do with the strength or the weakness of the individual and where our individual strengths are. So I just want to encourage everybody, you know, to take care of themselves. And latency is just a little bit too much of a big topic to start in here. If there are no more questions, Jeannie, have there been any others that I didn't see? Y'all put up Joe's email. Everybody look at it over at the chat, and you can get his email there, okay? And
also directly above that is the link for the Chinese Acupuncture Clinic's YouTube channel. And
right.
On that YouTube channel are all kinds of videos. We've had the previous conversations with Dr. Majebé on Sundays, as well as her Qigong for Children video, but all of those can be found on the YouTube channel.
And
I could just mention in passing that I have a YouTube channel as well. There's about 50 videos of mostly about Chinese herbs, specific herbs, but some of them are more general topics like the East-West conjunction or using Chinese herbs as food and different things like that. So you can access all that from my website, which is mountaingardensherbs.com.
And I really strongly recommend that all of you, particularly our students, go into Joe's website. He has so much information about herbs, and it's there free. He's put this up here directly from his heart. And I really want to thank you, Joe, for coming in tonight. Thank you so very much. We appreciate having you. And next week, we're going to have a practitioner who practices from a 5-element perspective. And Laurie Findale is going to come in and talk about some of the positive aspects of all of our meridian systems from an emotional perspective, and then those areas where we might have an imbalance that we didn't recognize. So I look forward to all of you joining us next week that can, for Laurie Findale. And Joe, thank you again from the bottom of my heart. It was really wonderful to have you here tonight. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Cissy. It was an honor.
Okay, it was an honor for me to have you, Joe. Okay. Bye-bye.